And so technology is causing us to objectify each other. It's causing us to view sex primarily as a commodity that we consume. And so that gets put onto people.
Thanks for joining us for another Techless Talk, where we explore how consumer technology shapes our relationships, health, and culture.
Hey everyone, welcome to Techless Talks. Starting today, we're going to dive in to talk about sex. Yeah, you got it, sex. That awkward conversation that often opens up vulnerability and brokenness within us. I want to go there because technology has become enmeshed with our sexuality. It's such an integral part of what's going on. It influences us daily. By opening this door, it's my genuine hope that what we can learn together can help us live more fulfilling lives. So, over the next few weeks, you're going to hear from some of the nation's leaders. These are the leading experts on sexuality today. Our first guest we're honored to have. So excited about today's interview. We're going to have Dr. Julie Slattery. She's a heavy hitter. She is a clinical psychologist, a speaker, and an author of 10 books. She's a pioneer in the conversations around sexuality. And we go back. My wife and I actually had the chance to meet her almost a decade ago when my wife and I met when she was co-hosting a national radio show. This was back before podcasts were even a thing. As the very first conversation in this series, I can't think of a better person than Julie Slattery, who can help set the stage and really just give us a macro picture of where we are today in the world regarding sexuality. What's going on? Where are we? Where have we been? Where are we today? It's just a broad macro view of the world when it comes to sexuality and brokenness and healing. What does that look like?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, the good news is we're talking about sexuality. So 15, 20 years ago, you didn't talk openly about things like pornography, sexual trauma, sexual desire. It all existed, but we didn't talk about those things. Sexual identity. You couldn't go anywhere to have an honest conversation about those topics. It didn't happen in the home. It didn't happen in community. It didn't happen in the church. You think about TV shows from back then. Yeah. Dick Van Dyke, they had twin beds for the husband and wife because it was seen as being too racy to have a single bed that a married couple would be sleeping in. So today we're talking about it everywhere. And we're talking about it in music. We're talking about it in our Netflix series and movies, education, politics has become sexualized. The news is sexualized. It's hard to get in your newsfeed a day where a sexual topic or story doesn't come up. So this is now becoming a major conversation in almost every sphere of life, in religious settings, educational settings. So there's a lot of conversation. I'd say that's one of the major changes.
So that sounds like it's a step in the right direction. We went from not talking about it at all to now we're talking about it maybe too much. But at least it's being discussed openly and there's courageous conversations being had. So that's kind of a good trend.
Yes, that is a good trend. I think where it gets complicated is we have to understand that our view of sexuality comes from our larger worldview of how we see humanity and how we make sense of our reality. And so there's really two basic ways to see the world, and this is very generalized, but we can either see the world as we were created, there's a designer, a God that created all of humanity, including our sexuality, and there's a purpose behind that design, or we can see the world as we're here by chance, we evolved, there is no intrinsic purpose for life, and so we create our purpose, we create our identity. And over the last 15 or 20 years, the Western culture, particularly America, has gone from this view of things, that there is somebody external to us that has a purpose and design for us, to the majority of people believing this view now of maybe even if there is a God, it's up to us to describe the purpose of our God. And so that has had very huge implications on how we think about sex and sexuality. And so a lot of the changes we see in our culture today are really based on that swing of our larger worldview conversation.
Help me connect the dots, because that's awesome. Okay, so we've shifted from this perspective to another perspective, the majority of people, but how does that connect to sexuality?
Yeah, sexuality becomes a major cornerstone of how we define ourselves today.
So part of our identity.
Right, it's a huge part of our identity. So as before, most Americans would say, a part of my identity is God created me, He made me for relationship. He made me for work. He made me to make a difference in the world. That was the larger narrative.
Yeah. So 20 years ago, that's something that people would say. That's
Yes.
how they would identify themselves.
Yeah. If you go back to politicians' speeches or just kind of the cultural thought of the day just 20 years ago, that was what people by and large believed. And there was a sense of right and wrong related to our sexual morality and our ethics. And so that has drastically changed since, let's say, the year 2000. To where the majority of Americans now believe that that's repressive, that keeps us from freedom. And so now if we get rid of our identity being rooted in a purpose and a creator, and he put us here for relationship and work, it becomes, all right, well, how do we define who we are?
Yeah.
And one of the biggest answers to that has been sexuality. We define who we are based on our experience, our perception, our sexual desires. And so that's one of the reasons that sex now is not just something that's talked about. Yeah. It's talked about with a lot of passion because for a lot of people, it represents their primary identity.
Gotcha. So, I mean, in a sense, sex has become God.
Yes.
And God was God 20 years ago, but this is the new God.
Well, I think we've become God.
Yeah, okay.
And sex has become a major way that we define our understanding of reality, of our personal existence. And so there's all this weight now being put on who we are sexually and what we do sexually. And that can be confusing for a lot of people.
What are you seeing today that you didn't see 20 years ago? Just boots on the ground, very practical things that you're starting to observe regarding sexuality.
Yeah. So the biggest shift is that we are separating sexuality from intimacy.
Wow.
So even, again, like 20 years ago, people that would not even say, I have a religion or moral around sexuality, they would associate sex with intimacy, with somebody I'm dating, somebody I'm attracted to. This is a way of expressing me close to somebody. Today, what we're seeing is that the expression of sexuality is more experimentation, self-expression, and it's not a connecting with another person. So for example, we see that the millennial generation and Gen Z actually is having less sex than any generation before them. And so teenagers today are not hooking up. They're not having sex with one another. Instead, they're sexting. They are looking at pornography. They are experimenting with different gender identities. And so they're viewing sex now as this is a self-expression more than it is a way for me to connect with another human being.
Interesting. So, I mean, this is a totally separate thing, but I'm familiar with something that I call garage door culture, where people come home from work, they drive in their garage, they close it, and that's kind of the extent of their relationships. And they do have very shallow, superficial relationships with hundreds or thousands of people, but they have this lack of deep connection with a very few gray-space, these cool relationships. And it seems like that's the same manifestation just in the world of sexual identity.
It is. It is. And what we're finding is that the more sexual freedom we have to experiment and to do whatever we want sexually, the epidemic of loneliness and isolation is becoming greater and greater and greater because the culture is kind of saying you can get your needs met through sexual expression. When my perspective is that we were actually created for intimacy. And that sex is an expression of intimacy.
So because we're being about sexual expression myself, it's putting intimacy on the back burner, and that's resulting in loneliness and lack of fulfillment.
Yeah, when we look at the younger generations and when we look at Americans as a whole, that levels of depression, anxiety, loneliness, isolation are just skyrocketing. There's a study done even before the pandemic that showed that 50% of Americans either always or almost always feel lonely. And so the more we put all of our intimacy needs into, no, it's just about sexual expression, and we sabotage true relationship and intimacy, the more we're saying, hey, this might feel good in a moment, but it's leading me to a life where I just feel isolated and alone.
And it's a snowball. It just gets worse and worse, and you go deeper into this isolated world. I mean, I've tasted that myself at moments in life, and so I understand.
Yes, we all have.
Wow.
Yeah.
Techless, we are kind of at the intersection of technology and culture. And so we're here at the Sexual Integrity Leadership Summit, and I keep hearing people say you cannot separate technology from sex and culture, and it's like just completely enmeshed. So what's your perspective on how technology plays into this whole equation?
Yeah, wow, you probably have more perspective than I do.
But you've been here for years, so I really want to know.
You just called me old, but that's okay, I am.
We might edit that out.
No, that's okay, it's true. There's some good things that come with getting
Wisdom.
older. Yeah. So I think part of it is our technology has become our go-between with me and another person. And so particularly with the younger generations, the primary way they know to connect is phone to phone, not face to face, not even voice to voice. And so they're being trained that connection is always happening with barriers. And so we see the result of this in that, hey, I might text something or put something on social media that I'd never say to a person face to face. I might be more hostile than I would be in person. I might be more vulnerable without realizing the consequences of that vulnerability. And we're also seeing that there's a lack of empathy in our relationships because the phone is the barrier.
Yeah.
And so that means that I can sexually objectify somebody without feeling bad about that. Whereas, man, if I had to look at this person and know they have a mother and a father and a brother and a sister and they're a real person, I wouldn't have done that. Like, I can recognize that that's harmful. And so technology is causing us to objectify each other. It's causing us to view sex primarily as a commodity that we consume. And so that gets put onto people. Like, even when we go into real relationships, we have to then break the mindset of sex is a commodity that you owe me now, instead of thinking about it as a connection with a real person.
Yeah, because we get started. I mean, you're defining relationship by this technology. And so now you walk into a real relationship for the first time after years of being trained on this is how relationship works. And you're looking at it and saying, how come you're not giving me what I expected or I've come to expect from this barrier?
It's almost as if you grew up, every meal you had, you went to a fast food restaurant, you went through a drive-through, and you could order what you want, and they made it right away the way you wanted. And then you went into a real kitchen in a home, and you say, yeah, I want a cheeseburger and milkshake. They'd be like, well, we're not serving cheeseburgers and milkshakes today. We don't even have what it takes to make them. And that's kind of what relationship feels like for people that have grown up with technologically mediated sexuality, like pornography. It's like, I'm used to getting what I want, when I want, to meet my needs and desires. In a relationship, that doesn't happen.
So it's completely redefined intimacy for us. And now we're starting from this place of selfishness and moving into a place of where I'm supposed to serve or be selfless, and it's just not working.
I don't think it's even redefined intimacy. I think it's replaced intimacy. Because there's no intimacy when I come into a relationship and it's all about you have to meet my needs. That actually sabotages intimacy. And so we kind of have to learn from the beginning what intimacy actually is and why it's so essential to our thriving.
Wow. All right, so we've kind of talked about where the world was, where it is today, the effect of technology on the world today, and I want to know what's the future. I mean, next 20 years, just hypothesis.
Oh my goodness.
What's your best perception of where we're headed?
Jeez. Well, you probably know more about the technological advances, but there's a lot of frontiers right now with virtual reality, pornography, and even robot sex, something that we would have seen in sci-fi movies.
That's going to be a reality.
Yeah, and we're already starting to see that become something that is on the new frontiers. But I also think, and this is my opinion, not everybody's going to agree with this, but I really believe that we are made by a creator and that we were designed for significant relationship and intimacy. And the more we fall for a counterfeit of something that looks like intimacy but really leads to isolation, the more we're going to see the pain and the consequences of that in our generation, the next generation, that people grow up without even having examples of what healthy relationship looks like, what it looks like to work through conflict, and what it looks like to love somebody unselfishly and to be loved. And so the future, in one sense, is discouraging if we keep going down that road. But I also know that we self-correct. And so I really hope that in this next generation, there's a longing for relationship, and people that would want to buy the Wisephone and say, hey, like technology is a good thing, but I don't want it to get in the way of what's most important to me, which is having genuine relationship with people.
Yeah. I mean, and I think regardless of what people believe, I think everybody deep down inside absolutely agrees that we were made for authentic connection.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of this pendulum culturally, right? So the pendulum has been swinging towards just this broken place of being completely disconnected from one another. And you have a hopeful vision that maybe we've reached the point of just exasperation and people are like, we're not made to live this way regardless. And we're maybe potentially swinging back the other way and trying to dive in and ask these deeper questions of what does it look like to really connect with people?
Yeah. I think we're really experimenting in our culture with what happiness looks like.
Yeah.
And if we're going down a road that isn't ultimately leading to fulfillment and human thriving, it is like going to fast food every day. Like there gets a point where you say, I'm sick. And maybe that chicken didn't look appetizing when it was first served to me, and the broccoli looks gross, but I am craving something that's of substance. And I think we're going to find that as people experiment with different technologies and relationships, they're going to be like, I need a relationship of substance.
Yeah.
I want to be known. I want to be seen. I want to be life-giving to other people.
Yeah. And fast food is easy, quick, convenient. It's not good for you. We understand that. And it seems like sexuality is kind of the same thing. That's what's been served to us. But people are starting to say, you know what? Maybe it costs more to go eat organic and to get home cooked meals. And it takes time and effort and energy and sweat, blood, and tears. But you know what? It's worth it, because at the end of the day, I'm going to be a healthier person for diving into this making these intentional decisions to do what it takes to live out authentic intimacy.
Yeah, that's what we hope for.
Awesome. I always like to leave the show with some sense of hope, and I'm all about like practical steps. And so I've got Dr. Julie's book here, and she has a handful of books on the table, but this is the one that I really picked up and want to recommend to you guys. It's called 25 Questions You're Afraid to Ask About Love, Sex, and Intimacy. What I love about this book is I guarantee you've asked yourself these questions before. I've asked myself a ton of these questions. I was flipping through it last night and I'm like, this is really good. I mean, questions like, is blank okay in the bedroom? I mean, I know you filled in the blank in your head just now. If I'm single, how far is too far? And one of my favorite ones is, how do I get past my shame? Very concise. I mean, look how small it is. Very approachable, very down to earth, and it's packed. It's not redundant. Just sentence after sentence is really, really solid. So would you mind unpacking a little bit more about why you wrote the book? What is this, just as a practical resource for people?
Yeah. So at my organization, we primarily reach out to women and just try to provide a safe place for sexual conversations. We have a lot of men that are engaging in that conversation now as well. But I just took some of the most common questions that women were asking over and over again. At every event I speak at, we always do an hour of live Q&A where people can text in questions anonymously.
Wow.
And so you see the same questions come up again and again.
Sure.
And so I was like, let's put that into a resource that is easy for people to flip through and find their question, or just for parents to have as a resource, even of, I know these questions are coming from my kids and I don't even know the answers. So that's kind of the heart behind it.
My wife and I just finished reading the book together, and it really led to some great conversations between us. If you're interested in more content from Julie, you can check out her organization, Authentic Intimacy, on AuthenticIntimacy.com. Julie also has a weekly podcast. It's called Java with Julie. If you're spelling it, it's Julie with an I. There's no E on the end. And it comes out every single Monday, and she talks about sexuality from both a psychological and a faith perspective. I want to sincerely thank you guys for joining. If you wouldn't mind subscribing, that would help us out a lot. And let us know in the comments below what you'd love to hear about in future Techless Talks after we're done with this series on sexuality. Until next time.